Hi Year 11. I'm going to give you a little bit of commentary on our unit of work for Term 2, Module A. It is Narratives that Shape Our World. And this is a different unit and module to what Standard and EALD will be doing, so please don't get confused. This is specifically advanced. Okay, Narratives that Shape Our World. And our focus topic is going to be on villainy and immorality. Okay, now is the time to pause and read through the rubric prescription. This is straight from NESA. I've also attached a Google Doc version of it if you would prefer read it off that. So please now pause, read through all of this. Obviously the bolded areas are of most importance. Alright, so I've prescribed texts for the unit under this bracket of villainy and immorality. Now this is essentially a contextual study. Okay, the rubric specified ideas, attitudes and values of context and the texts that emerge from these. So we're going to be doing a bit of a timeline of texts that explore villainy and immorality starting back in the 10th century, working through to the Renaissance, 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, into the 19th century, sort of dominated by the Victorian era, even though we're looking at an American writer, into the 20th century, and finally 21st century. So all of these texts are obviously exploring notions of villainy and immorality, and they are all in different textual forms. So what we are looking at is how this notion of villainy and immorality has evolved, or perhaps stayed, remained stagnant throughout time. But then also how these contexts impact on the ideas, attitudes, values explored in the text, as was influenced by their time. And also how different forms explore the notion of villainy and immorality and essentially affects how the stories are told. Okay, so nice focus on contextual storytelling. Okay, assessment. There will be no formal assessment, but I will just go through what it would have been so you can understand the direction that the coursework will be taking, even though there's no assessment at the end. So it was a multimodal text on villainy and immorality. So just to clarify that a multimodal text is a text that just has more than one mode of communication. So students last year, there was a wide variety of different multimodal texts. We had a podcast and transcript. There are a few Instagram pages with written text on the various images, some fabulous video essays with commentary. There was a puppet show, which was fabulous, a composer's journal. There were creative artworks with commentary and written text, PowerPoint presentations and posters. Okay, so what had to be included in these particular multimodal texts? Students had to do 2 texts and they had to be from different contexts, so at different stages in history, and one of them had to be one that we studied in class, and obviously these 2 texts are exploring the notion and concepts around villainy and immorality. Now students adopted various devices and used visual cues, audio cues, etc. To engage audiences, to ensure that the content and the way they delivered it and presented it was appropriate, or at least cohesive, and then was easily accessible for the audience as well. So the information they had to include were the contextual features of the time in which the texts were composed. So what sort of ideas, attitudes and values were present in the context in which the texts were created, and how did those ideas, attitudes, values influence the text, or how did we see them emerge? Students also had to include research and acknowledgement of the text's impact or reception in its time when it was released, and also how it has continued to impact audiences. The students focused on the notions and elements of storytelling adopted by the various composers and their various text types, and then obviously analysis. So students provided several textual references and then explained how various forms, features, devices, techniques shaped meaning about villainy and immorality. Okay, so because we haven't got a formal assessment task, how are we going to develop multimodal skills and analytical skills? It's imperative that we engage in multimodal and digital texts and sort of play around with creating them and composing them ourselves, as it is a requirement of the HSC syllabus. And multimodal presentation is the mode of your first HSC assessment task. So it's not something we can avoid. It's also vital that we become proficient analysers of how different textual forms use a variety of language features, devices and techniques to shape meaning. And we need to be able to articulate this analysis with control and sophistication. So at this stage, I'm thinking we'll do a collaborative multimodal text that provides a timeline of villainy and immorality and how it has evolved, shifted, altered throughout different stages of history. Each student will provide a text and analysis on it to contribute to the timeline using various digital tools, and these will allow audience access to the information. So I've created a little sample using a digital timeline tool called Sutori or Suttery, I don't know how to pronounce it. So I'll just show you, this is the link here, obviously very plain looking at the moment. And it does, the whole point of multimodal is we are trying to engage visually, aesthetically, or auditorily. In a contemporary world, we can't just provide lots and lots of written information. It does need to be presented in a particular way. So we'll play around with that. So this is a digital timeline. Here's our title, Villainy and Immorality, a little byline, starting in the Middle Ages, the 10th century, with Beowulf. I've got a little link to a contextual document there to explain the sort of circumstances surrounding the composition of the text. We've got a little visual image, we've got some info from Encyclopedia Britannica, I've got a link to a thug note summary, etc. And then whatever text is contributed that comes next in the timeline will be inserted here until we've hopefully got a fabulous digital timeline of great texts that explore this notion of villainy and immorality, to show how it has either shifted, altered, changed throughout time, how we tell stories about villainy and immorality, and perhaps some of the elements that have not changed over time. Okay, so just 2 tasks that I would like you to do before next lesson. First of all is to reflect on the unit title, Narratives that Shape Our World. Before we investigate and unpack our focus topic, which is villainy and immorality, I want you to reflect on and brainstorm ideas in reference with our module, Narratives that Shape Our World. Firstly, what is the difference between a narrative and a text? How can a narrative shape the world? So what, unpack this word. What does it mean? What can it do? What does that look like? Synonyms for it. And then create a list of synonyms, phrases that could be associated with this notion of narratives that shape our world. So we need to remember that narrative refers to storytelling. Therefore, it may not necessarily be the plot itself that shapes the world, but the way it's told, the perspective the narrative is told from, its structure, the subject matter and perhaps inclusion of taboo or controversial issues, how it proposes alternative or different attitudes. It might be a little bit out of place in its time, perhaps ahead of its time, rebelling against the status quo or cultural societal norms? Does it resonate across multiple contexts, cultures, and eras? Does it transcend time? And perhaps the reactions, responses, and reception has sort of put or placed a text in this category of being able to shape the world. Okay, and then your second task is to have a look at one of these seminal texts. Essentially, narratives that shape our world are significant texts that are worthwhile for all audiences to engage with. Whether they enjoy or like it is irrelevant. We need to come to an appreciation of the craft and or subject matter it deals with. Research the notion of a narrative that has shaped our world and select a narrative that you believe reflects this and that you are somewhat familiar with. So we're looking at canonical texts, classics, those that have been adapted many times, frequently discussed in public discourse and public culture, etc. It could be a text that you've studied at school. That's perfectly fine. Just briefly identify a title, its form, composer, and year of composition. Briefly describe the narrative. And then why or how was it influential or involved with shaping the world? And this is from your perspective. Okay, so those two tasks, new Word doc, submit on the assignment box. It does not have to be onerous or lengthy, but just want to get you thinking about the topic. Okay, till soon. Ta-ta.